We also see a significant increase in divorce during this time period. Now, there's probably a million different reasons for this. I would say definitely the onset of depression and anxiety with the associated changes in perimenopause to menopause and beyond probably have a significant impact on this. We know that sexual mismatch is also a big part of this that we see in partners. Because a woman's hormones are declining rapidly, or they're doing the ketchup bottle experience where it's all over the place, often sexual desire goes out the window, just from a biochemical standpoint. Ladies, are you ready to take control of your menopause journey? Introducing Mastering the Pause, the ultimate ebook that empowers you with the knowledge and tools to navigate this transformative phase with confidence and grace. Packed with expert guidance on hormone replacement, essential lab tests, personalized diet and lifestyle strategies, this book is your secret weapon to combat menopause-related challenges. Discover how to maintain a healthy metabolism, ward off belly fat, and embrace this new chapter of your life. Download your copy now at guide.hormoneshelp.com. That's guide.hormoneshelp.com. And let's make this a smooth and informed menopause transition today. According to the National Institute of Mental Health, 1 in 5 women experience depression during perimenopause and menopause. A study published by the Journal of Women's Health found that 1 in 3 women experience anxiety at the same time. Panic attacks are also increased at the same time, and another study by the Journal of Clinical Psychology found 44% of women experience anxiety and panic attacks during this transitional season. So, we're going to dive in today into the activities of perimenopause and menopause and their impact on your mood. So today we're digging in deep on anxiety, depression, and mood symptoms during perimenopause and menopause. One of the things that has always frustrated me about the medical establishment's treatment of menopause was that once the Women's Health Initiative was released and erroneously picked up and ran with falsified data, is that the overwhelming recommendations at that moment became cognitive behavioral therapy, which really meant you needed to work on your headspace around your symptoms because it was really a mental health issue, not a hormone issue. So today we're digging in deep. We're going to go into exactly what's really going on. So like I said, depression and anxiety are hallmarks. And again, it's either 1 in 5 or 1 in 3 women experience it. So here's the thing. If we look at the duration of just the mood symptoms alone, on average, is an average of 4.8 years. And so if we know that women experience an average of 8 years of perimenopause to menopause symptoms, a good half of those years have significant impact on mood. And this highlights the long-term impact of these hormonal changes on mental health. So let's dig into what's really happening. So number one, when we go through menopause and perimenopause, the work by Dr. Mosconi's group and several other research teams has shown that there's massive remodeling of the brain as we start to lose the hormones associated with our cycles, which is estrogen and progesterone predominantly, but we also have testosterone. And what it really shows is that there's these neurobiological changes that have occurred. This means that brain regions that actually produce neurotransmitters associated with things like depression and anxiety decrease, right? Decreases the production of serotonin, actually increases the level of cortisol within the brain. Now, most of us think of cortisol as something that's produced by the adrenals and part of the stress response, but we also have the production of cortisol in the brain, and the more cortisol you have circulating in the brain, the more it occupies and sort of beats up on the receptors for these other feel-good neurotransmitters like serotonin, epinephrine, GABA, and dopamine. So this increase in cortisol and the loss of serotonin during this time period and the changes of the brain regions and actually the kind of remapping of what they call your neuro pathway. And so what that is think of it all the superhighways that your body has built over the decades you've been on the planet. Your body starts to sort of pull those pathways apart and reroutes the roads. And ultimately, it changes how your body sees the world or how your brain sees the world because of loss of those hormones. And we know that depression and anxiety during this time period have a significant impact on daily life, including things like relationship, work and work experience, and overall well-being. If we look at the just sheer increase in volume in divorces during this time period, we see that women start to leave the workforce or start to alter their working behavior. And right now it's estimated that $26.8 billion is attributed or changed in the economy every year. So we have a loss of $26.8 billion of true economic growth because of the change of women's function in the workplace because of this time period. Now, we also see sleep disturbances. Now, a lot of people wonder if this is the chicken or the egg. Do the sleep disturbances that occur, right? So insomnia, waking in the middle of the night, does this cause the symptoms of, let's say, agitation, anxiety, and depression? Or is it another symptom of the changes in the brain? If we look at a Journal of Clinical Sleep Medicine, there was a study that found that 75% of women experience sleep disturbances during this perimenopause to menopause transition. And this happens to be one of the first symptoms that show up, not one of the last. And so we know that if we get poor sleep, if the sleep quality is poor, if the sleep duration is short, and if it's interrupted, we're going to see a higher degree of cortisol in the brain, again, damaging to the neurotransmitter system. And we're also going to see a less than stellar mood because of it. So let's talk about why. All right, so depression. Here's the solution. The simple fact is the hormones declining are why we're experiencing these symptoms. They're not new and unique and exclusive of their own. The anxiety and depression are actually a symptom of the loss of hormones, and I'm going to go into why. So the problem is anxiety, depression. Solution is replace hormones and get them back online. We'll talk about some other ones, but if you really look at what's happening, it is the loss of these hormones that are driving it. So again, the hormonal changes. It's the loss of progesterone first, which is a very calming neurotransmitter, and then fluctuation in the variability of estrogen, and then the loss of both of those that leads to changes not only in our cycles and our metabolism, but it actually changes the neurotransmitters themselves. Serotonin and dopamine, norepinephrine and epinephrine, and GABA. And that impact is seen in the brain, but it's also seen in the gut because 95 to 97% of your neurotransmitters are actually produced in the gut. And we have an enteric nervous system that is there in the gut. So think of that as a second brain in the gut itself that actually regulates and builds these neurotransmitters. And there's receptors there for those neurotransmitters that not only affect the gut, but have kind of a superhighway straight up to the brain through the vagal nerve. And estrogen and progesterone, testosterone, these hormones can influence those receptors, not only in the gut, but then again in the brain. So I'm going to go into the science and the research so we can really go into it. So particularly if we look at the first one, so estrogen and serotonin. Estrogen has an influence on the serotonergic system, right? So this is the production of serotonin, the regulation of serotonin, the attachment of serotonin to its receptors. So think of it as a key, the fact that it can go into its lock and actually turn the key. And it regulates, obviously, mood at this time, but serotonin also gets made into melatonin, which is a signal to your body to go to sleep. But it's also, in and itself, part of your neurotransmitter system that helps you feel happy. And happy, not elated happy, but let's just say kumbaya, right? I feel like things are copacetic. Now, serotonin plays a role in appetite also. So studies have shown that estrogen enhances the synthesis of serotonin. So what does that mean in non-geek speak? Estrogen helps you make serotonin. Serotonin makes you feel good. Serotonin at appropriate levels helps you control your appetite. Serotonin at appropriate levels helps you feel calm, cool, collected. Serotonin at appropriate levels helps you sleep. And serotonin and estrogen help the receptors bind. So if I have adequate serotonin, my adequate estrogen, my serotonin is synthesized properly, so it's made. My serotonin can get taken up and utilized in the nervous system, and the receptors or the keyhole for the serotonin actually works well. So estrogen enhances that. So when we see a decline in estrogen during perimenopause and menopause, it leads to a decrease in serotonin, which contributes to the development of depression and anxiety. We've known this research for a really long time. This is not something new. So that's estrogen's role with serotonin. Now, estrogen also influences another neurotransmitter called norepinephrine. Now, norepinephrine is involved in regulating stress and stress response and awareness and attention. So I'm going to divert for just a second and talk about the drugs we use most commonly for depression and anxiety, and particularly depression. Most of the drugs that are prescribed are going to be your SSRIs, which are selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors. So essentially what that means is you produce serotonin and the drug blocks the body's ability to take this serotonin that was circulating and bring it back into the synapse and then get it recycled. So those drugs keep what you're making circulating. And then there are drugs called SNRIs, selective serotonin and norepinephrine reuptake inhibitors. So those drugs inhibit both serotonin and norepinephrine reuptake after your body has sort of let it circulate. And those are the most common drugs to prescribe. Now, when the Women's Health Initiative came out, what did we do? Instead of prescribing hormone replacement therapy, appropriate bioidentical estrogen, appropriate bioidentical progesterone, and I would argue also appropriate testosterone, instead of replacing what is instrumental in the loss of function in these neurotransmitters, it automatically became we need SSRIs or SNRIs. And yes, maybe it might cover up some of the symptoms, but it is not helping get to the root cause of what caused it to begin with. So research has demonstrated that estrogen increases norepinephrine activity in the brain. Again, through similar mechanisms, it helps the synthesis of norepinephrine and it helps receptor binding of norepinephrine. And when we see a decrease in estrogen during the menopause transition, we see a direct reduction in norepinephrine activity. And this, again, is going to lead to mood issues. Now, estrogen also plays a role with dopamine. So dopamine is our reward neurotransmitter. And it's really, we used to joke that it was kind of like your nature's version of cocaine. And that's not really quite true. I mean, yes, we see a significant rise in dopamine with street drugs like cocaine and ecstasy. But dopamine is involved in motivation and reward and pleasure, and particularly anticipation. So I often hear from the women in my clinic, they'll say, Betty, man, I just don't care. I feel really flat. I just have very low motivation anymore. I don't feel like myself. I just feel sort of unplugged. And it really is part of that dopamine pathway that is being unplugged. We aren't motivated. We don't go after reward. And then when we do get rewards, the pleasure isn't really there. And this plays a role not only in the things that you love to do, whether it's shopping or exercising or whatever it might be, but also can play a role in sexual activity, intimacy, and other very personal and interpersonal important activities of life. So again, estrogen modulates dopamine synthesis, release, and receptor expression, again, binding. So when we see that decline in estrogen during perimenopause and menopause, we see a significant loss in the function of dopamine. And so this leads to the development of depression and what they call anhedonia, which is, again, no pleasure seeking, no excitement, and it definitely falls over into sort of the more esoteric sexual activities and other things. Just things aren't exciting, thrilling, or even motivating. Now, estrogen also plays a role in one of our other calming neurotransmitters, or what we call inhibitory neurotransmitters. So we have two major ones. One is serotonin, and this other one is GABA. GABA stands for gamma-aminobutyric acid. It is the primary inhibitor neurotransmitter in the central nervous system. So this is the most prevalent calming neurotransmitter we make, and it is crucial in regulating anxiety. And so research has demonstrated, again, that estrogen enhances the receptor function and increases GABA synthesis. And when we see that decline in estrogen, we're going to see a reduction in GABA activity, increasing the likelihood of anxiety. And again, right now, anxiety and panic attacks actually beat out depression as a significant neurotransmitter and mood symptom of perimenopause and menopausal system. Now, I want to jump to progesterone. So progesterone also plays a really important role in your neurotransmitters. So progesterone, and I've had other conversations about progesterone. Progesterone is a huge regulator of GABA impact. So progesterone is the hormone that counterbalances your estrogens, especially during the second half of your cycle. So it rises rapidly in the second half of the cycle, and its job is to really prepare the uterine lining for implantation, progest, so pro-grow. And so progesterone actually helps that part of the regulatory activity of fertility. But it's also regulating GABA, and it has an inhibitory effect. So it helps that GABA inhibitory effect function. So research indicates that GABA levels decrease during perimenopause and menopause. And as it decreases, we also see that progesterone is playing a role. So progesterone actually declines before estrogen. So we start that in most cases in our early 40s. Some of us, like myself, it was in our late 30s actually that we started to see a decline in progesterone. And when that happens, the binding receptor, so the keyhole for GABA, is not actually functional, right? So think of it as I'm losing keyholes. And so my GABA doesn't work as well. And so we not only see maybe an increase in anxiety and panic attacks, but GABA is also instrumental in helping us stay asleep. So if I'm starting to see sleep disruption, it's often the interplay of the loss of progesterone and that impact on GABA early on that really signals that early onset of insomnia, because that is probably, I would say, one of the most prevalent and earliest symptoms of your transition into full menopause. And there was a study produced by the Journal of Women's Health that found that GABA levels decreased at least 20% during this transition. So can that be impactful? You go, well, I may have 80%, but if my receptor doesn't work because progesterone is already declined, then I may not be able to bind very well what I am making. So that decrease in GABA increases anxiety and would increase the likelihood of panic attacks. And GABA also regulates the stress response. So if it's decreased, we're going to have a different stress response. So we're going to feel more restlessness, irritability, and insomnia. So your take-home message here is progesterone impacts GABA, which is your natural benzodiazepine for your brain. And when I don't have enough because I'm going through perimenopause, I'm going to get restlessness, irritability, anxiety, panic attacks, and insomnia. We also can look at the length and duration of neurotransmitters, right? So as your brain goes through this remodeling activity, and we see the changes in not only estrogen and progesterone, but the impact on your mood, we also know that the duration in which you go through the transition of basically being fertile to perimenopause is altered, right? So when we look at the research, there was a research looking at neuroimaging studies. So neuroimaging research has provided further evidence of the hormonal change on the brain function, up until really having to look at PET scans, which is called positron emission tomography. They did a study looking at women and found that women in perimenopause exhibited all of these things. So they actually could see inside the brain the decrease of serotonin receptor binding in several preferential brain regions. And another study looking at functional magnetic resonance imaging, or fMRI, demonstrated that altered brain activation patterns in response to emotional stimulus was different between perimenopausal women and premenopausal women. So essentially what they saw was the premenopausal women, so the women who were fertile, hormones were all balanced, they had a very balanced and regulated response to stressors. But women that were in perimenopause, different regions of the brain lit up and they were not as balanced and robust. So we can see this not only in the lab data itself, but we can actually see it in actual imaging. So what's your major take-home message? So I'm going to make this really clear, is 1 in 5 women experience depression during the menopause transition, right? So the average number of years is 8 years. That means some women go 15, 16 years, and some women have shorter duration. 1 in 3 women experience anxiety, and they also may experience panic attacks, which significantly increase in the perimenopause transition. The solution to these changes in your brain can be multifold. I, of course, would argue that appropriate replacement of bioidentical hormones during the transition of perimenopause to menopause and beyond is the appropriate treatment for these issues. Not only for depression and anxiety, we have 69 other symptoms that go along with the transition of perimenopause to menopause, and we have an increase in all-cause mortality. So if we look at the symptom, anxiety and depression, the solution is replace hormones and put them back in, because those hormones, estrogen, progesterone, and testosterone, impact your serotonin, impact your dopamine, your GABA, norepinephrine, and epinephrine, which collectively help you stay balanced, feel copacetic and happy, have motivation, and have pleasure, and also keep you calm and help you sleep. Because here's this true situation. Women going through perimenopause and menopause statistically have a lower quality of life score compared to women who are premenopausal. And depression and anxiety score quite high on those actual measures. And so during perimenopause and menopause, we experience just a lower quality of life. What's interesting, if you look at Dr. Mosconi's work, if we get really far out from that time period, so if we see women in their mid-60s and above, it seems that the brain remodeling that goes on through menopause may actually transition that time period, and we may actually see sort of a stabilization of these mood things that we see during perimenopause and menopause. But again, if a woman's going to spend anywhere from 8 to 15 years in this process, why would we choose to spend a decade to a decade and a half having a lower quality of life? In many cases, when we actually have the opportunity to really have an impact or do the things that we really care about, because it's the first time in multiple decades that we actually can look at our own life and really try and figure out, what do we want to have out of it, right? What would we prefer to see the rest of our life as part of it? So that, to me, is the most important part. So when we look at menopausal therapy, right, I believe that we should replace these hormones. I didn't go into testosterone a lot today. The research in women's use of testosterone is pretty limited. Again, the FDA, not because they are caring about women's health, but they just have a myopic and patriarchal view of hormones, particularly when we look at testosterone. So testosterone is FDA cleared for lack of sexual desire, meaning you don't want to have sex. So therefore, the only reason why you would need testosterone is for that reason, which is ludicrous. At any given time, we have anywhere from 3 to 7 times the amount of testosterone circulating when we're premenopausal than we do estrogen. So we have a ton of testosterone that circulates, and it declines along with the other ones. And so testosterone definitely plays a role in our emotional state and also our sense of intimacy and pleasure, because I would argue that sexual pleasure is a significant portion of our life fulfillment. It doesn't have to be with a partner. It doesn't have to be there. It could be you by yourself. It could be with a partner. It could be whatever you want it to be. But the reality is that is also a really profound part of our experience of life. So perimenopause and menopause are critical periods that affect our mental health. And it's really the hormonal changes that is playing a role. Now, if we look at the psychosocial things that also go on during this time period, there may be other things that also increase the likelihood of depression and anxiety. You know, some of it can be things like what I've experienced for the last year, which is having to care for an ailing parent. Some people may experience this early in life, but statistically, if you're in your 40s, 50s, and even early 60s, often you may be not only potentially raising a family or caring for a family, but you might also be managing the health of an ailing parent, which adds a significant amount of stress to your day. And in many cases, these women are also trying to hold together a job and handle many other tasks at the same time. And we see women leaving the workforce because of this. So the other thing we have to remember is while our hormones are all over the place, we also have significant psychosocial stressors by adding additional responsibilities to our plate. We often may have children that are either empty nesting or, embarking on empty nesting in the next few years, Or in some cases, we may also have boomerang children that, because of changes in societal means and 1,000 other things that I don't want to talk about today, might be putting you in a situation as somebody who felt like they might be able to take their first step of being a little bit self-care focused, where they may be having to recare for adult children and or taking care of grandbabies and other things, where they're not able to really step in and look at what do they want out of life, right? So if we're parenting an adult child, or we're having to parent an adult child's children, or we're having to take on additional social responsibility for other adults, that is going to have a stress on our life. We also see a significant increase in divorce during this time period. Now, there's probably a million different reasons for this. I would say definitely the onset of depression and anxiety with the associated changes in perimenopause to menopause and beyond probably have a significant impact on this. We know that sexual mismatch is also a big part of this that we see in partners. Because a woman's hormones are declining rapidly, or they're doing the ketchup bottle experience where it's all over the place, often sexual desire goes out the window, just from a biochemical standpoint. Now, if we add to it the changing body, the societal images that we sort of, and box that we put women in to have an expectation that women never age, we can't age because then we're dried up, old, and invisible, that's going to add to it. We also see, again, because we have a loss of this sort of motivation, pleasure seeking, and other things. I tell the men in my practice all the times, because I often see, and my team often sees, husbands and brothers and, other individuals, and they are always perplexed that women don't initiate sexual interest or sexual desire, and especially as we get a little bit older. And I'm like, we are like a slow pot of water coming to boil. We need to have intimacy first, and then desire shows up. But when we go into menopause, essentially it's like we get shifted back to about 9 years old. And I'm making an exaggerated point here, but we get shifted back to pre-puberty. We could watch paint dry, and it would have about as much sexual interest as anything else, because it no longer is on our horizon. It is from an intimacy standpoint, because we want to have intimacy with our partner, but it is not something that we are driven to do. And it's because of the loss of the hormones, and I would argue that it's also the changes in the neurotransmitters. So loss of sexual desire has an impact on our mood, but we also see a greater degree of divorce during this time period. And again, it's, you have two people that may have been parenting people for multiple decades, and all of a sudden they look at each other for the first time and they're like, ooh, I don't even know who we are when we remove ourselves from the parenting role. And so there's so many pieces of this. That's not only the chemistry side, the psychosocial side, and then the physical symptoms. All of these things impact our expression of anxiety and depression and irritability. I'll throw that one in there too. So ultimately, what does this mean? That the perimenopause and menopausal transition are critical periods that can affect every part of mental health, every part. Those hormonal changes are, I would say, paramount. And the psychosocial stressors and the physical changes and maybe the lack of sleep and those other things that we see are secondary to that. And there's solid evidence showing that hormone replacement not only rebalances those hormones, but we see a decline in the symptoms associated with depression, anxiety. And I would argue that most women should consider hormone replacement and work with a practitioner that absolutely knows how to appropriately manage a menopausal woman. Again, doctors don't have training. They're lucky. Gynecology is lucky to have 3 to 4 hours of training. Gynecology is a surgical specialty, not a hormone specialty. So you need a hormone and menopause masters that actually understand how to replace these hormones. And it's a travesty. I was looking this weekend, and the bioidentical estradiol patch is running out. We don't have enough, because women are starting to get smart, and they're starting to understand that they've been sold a raw bill of goods. And we have an epidemic of, medical systems that ignore women's health and gaslight us. But we also now have prescriptive delays and prescriptive problems on actually getting the treatment that helps us the most. So the other piece of this, because I love my tribe, If you find that you are challenged with getting somebody to listen to you, drop them, fire them, find somebody who listens, and fight for your right to feel good. We shouldn't have to spend this next act feeling terrible at the same time. So I want to thank you for listening to Menopause Mastery. And if you loved this, please subscribe. That really helps us actually get out there and get more guests, have better shows, and we want to spread the word because together we rise. Thank you so much for tuning in to the Menopause Mastery podcast. You are why I'm here, and I am so very grateful. Hit subscribe so you don't miss any wisdom on creating the most exceptional life on our terms. If this episode has helped you in any way, please share it with a friend to spread the love, and together we rise. You can follow me on social media at Betty Murray, PhD, and you can reach me online at bettymurray.com.